They condemned, they voted, they finally intervened, but what is the coalition actually aiming for in Libya? As the bombs keep falling, the international community is scrambling to define its mission. But did Barack Obama's speech define or confuse the situation further? Libya and the endgame. This is Inside Story. Hello there, I'm Kamal Santamaria. So we're looking at Libya from the international perspective today, all the developments and the justifications for what's happening there and indeed what might yet happen. Because airstrikes to protect the Libyan people have been clearly set out and explained, but they've also acted as cover effectively for the opposition forces in their advance westwards, probably outside of the official mandate, and we'll discuss that later. There's also been little clarity about where they're leading. So with all the confusion, US President Barack Obama made his first speech on the matter since the intervention began. Obama said he ordered the military action to enforce UN Resolution 1973 because if the coalition had waited one more day, there could have been a massacre among Libyans by Gaddafi's forces. At the same time, he spoke of the limitations of action and made a distinction between intervention and regime change. In fact, he delivered a straight dismissal of more aggressive action, describing any attempt to include regime change as a mistake.
The task that I assigned our forces to protect the Libyan people from immediate danger and to establish a no-fly zone carries with it a UN mandate and international support. It's also what the Libyan opposition asked us to do. If we tried to overthrow Gaddafi by force, our coalition would splinter.
Which begs the question, if he and the international community aren't trying to overthrow Colonel Gaddafi by force, then what is the proposed endgame for Libya? Let's discuss this and plenty more with our three guests today. In Oxford in the UK is Oliver Miles. He's a former British ambassador to Libya. In Dubai, Mustafa Alani, director of the security program at the Gulf Research Centre. And rounding out our panel in Washington, D.C. is Ali Abu Zakuk, who is the president of the Libyan Human and Political Development Forum. Gentlemen, I thank you all for your time. I'm going to start with actually the same question for all three of you, and just a brief answer if you wouldn't mind first. Let's start with Oliver Miles in the UK. The very simple question is, what is this coalition doing? What is its end game?
Oh, no, that's fine.
I don't think it's got an end game. What it's doing is protecting life, protecting civilians. That's very clearly set out in the mandate, repeated by the British government, by the American government and the other governments. But that's not an end game.
Mustafa Alani, your thoughts?
Removing the regime. I don't see any other objective actually apart from removing the regime or participating in the removal of the regime.
And Ali Abu Zakuk.
I think the end game is really Gaddafi has lost its legitimacy, and it is now the time for the Libyan people to choose their own, and the world power, coalition to help them achieve that goal.
Okay, so a few simple answers there just to get us off the mark, setting out some ideas. Let's go back to Oliver Miles in Oxford to start. This idea, and you said it, protecting the Libyan people, that has been the number one official line, if I can say that. Is it perhaps, in the end, a bit weak, a bit ambiguous? Because you can protect the Libyan people, you can protect any people in any number of ways with any level of force.
Well, yes, of course, that's true. But I think that the reason that it was made the objective of the Security Council resolution, and it was the most ambitious target that would have got through if the resolution had been more in the direction of regime change, it wouldn't have passed the Council. So I think what we all had in mind, what our governments had in mind, was that if we act in this way to protect civilians, and the first step towards that is the no-fly zone and the use of air power to knock out Gaddafi's superior weapons, which he was using or could use to endanger civilians. Once we've done that, the thought was the Libyans can do the rest. That'll be the end of Gaddafi, and then we have the more open and more attractive question of what are we going to do about the next stage. The fallacy of that argument, of course, is that it may not work. We may protect the civilians, we may knock out the air force, we may knock out the tanks, we may knock out the artillery, and yet the Libyan opposition, the rebels, are still unable to strike a decisive blow against Gaddafi.
But it ends up being, and I sort of mentioned this before, helping the opposition, doesn't it? And that's not really in the mandate.
That's right. That's the fatal ambiguity, or at least I say fatal. It may not turn out to be fatal, because if I'm wrong, and I hope I am, and if the momentum of the rebels is sufficient to carry the day, then the Libyans will sort themselves out, Gaddafi will go, and we'll then have the problems I mentioned of, what's going to take his place. That could happen still, but it's quite a long way away at the moment, and my view increasingly is that it's not likely to happen because the military force to overthrow Gaddafi is not there.
Let's go to Ali Abu Zakuk in Washington for his view. I see from the badge on your shirt there, we can clearly see which side of the divide that you are on. Let me ask you about what we were talking about there, this idea of the no-fly zone, the coalition providing cover for the opposition forces. I mean, as I said to Oliver, it does go beyond the mandate, doesn't it? It's helpful, I guess, to their cause, but it's not what the coalition's there to do.
No, but I will question the actions of the coalition. If we are seeing from Al Jazeera and other satellite stations what is happening in Misrata and in Zantan, the civilians are being massacred, civilians are being bombarded with shells and tanks and snipers, and these people need to be protected. It hasn't come to the plate yet. So even if we restricted it to the linguistic terms of protecting the civilians, I think there is a lot of work to be needed to protect the civilians. Not to speak about the civilians in other cities like Tripoli and others who are being now in a large detention camp.
Mustafa Alani, is that all it comes down to in the end? Protect the civilians at whatever cost, despite what the mandate says you can and can't do?
I don't see it this way, actually, because the mandate of the Security Council resolution basically is to protect civilians. You cannot have a Security Council resolution saying removing the regime. This is unspoken objective, and everybody, even the Russian and the Chinese, when they approve the resolution, they understand what the end result of this resolution. But what the resolution established, two principles: no flying zone and no drive zone as well. Because the attack on the ground is basically related to no drive zone, to paralyze the land forces of Mr. Gaddafi, especially the tanks and the other equipment. So eventually, this is our aim, to paralyze the forces of the regime and to allow the rebel to move on the regime and to finish the game.
Well, seeing as you're talking about regime change, let's have a listen a bit more to what Barack Obama had to say on that issue.
Of course, there is no question that Libya and the world would be better off with Gaddafi out of power. I, along with many other world leaders, have embraced that goal and will actively pursue it through non-military means. But broadening our military mission to include regime change would be a mistake.
Mustafa, let me come back to you again in Dubai just to talk about that. Barack Obama saying we're actively embracing the goal of removing Gaddafi, but we will pursue it through non-military means. To me, it all sounds like a bit of a mixed message. We want Gaddafi gone, we're going on with force, but we're not going to use force to get rid of him.
Well, we know the security resolution did not allow the removal of the regime as an objective, did not allow to arm the rebels, and did not allow the land intervention, ground intervention. But still, removing the regime is an objective, is still achievable if the outside power were able to disable the regime military. And this is what they're hoping. Definitely, Mr. Obama have the complex of Mr. Bush and what Mr. Bush done in Iraq. He will never admit publicly that he is committed to this objective. We understand that. But in reality, they will do everything, intelligence-wise and military-wise, to bring the result of removing Mr. Gaddafi.
So in the end, and let's put this back to Ali Abu Zakuk in Washington, D.C., we've got a resolution which says take action, but it doesn't take the action that President Obama is stating he wants. He wants Gaddafi gone, but he's got a resolution that doesn't allow him to get there, but he'll still keep talking about it. This is the ambiguity I'm talking about.
Well, let's take the resolution. What it says that there will be an arms embargo against Gaddafi's regime. The resolution does not speak about an arms embargo against the opposition, even though some people might say it's an an arms embargo against Libya. No, I think the resolution is dedicated towards Gaddafi himself and towards his regime. The second point is that when the anti-Gaddafi forces or the pro-democracy forces are trying to get rid of Gaddafi, I think it will be important from the coalition to help them in a way that do not allow them to really balance the powers. The Gaddafi's machinery and all the security forces he has are not, if it were taken side by side, equal to the less equipment, less armed rebels or pro-democracy forces. So the pacification by the world powers, by the intervention, will help get rid, at least liberate the cities that are still under the control of Gaddafi.
But his forces,
and that will end, and that will automatically end up the story of Gaddafi without speaking about regime change. The change of the regime is a Libyan mission.
The thing is, his forces. Sorry, if I just interrupt you, because you're talking about his forces there. In the end, they will. Yes, other cities might be liberated. In the end, all of those forces will probably consolidate around the strongholds, the likes of Tripoli. Now, that the coalition can't very well go in and start bombing a major city like Tripoli. So again, you keep coming back to this point. You come back to this dead end that the resolution only takes you so far.
No. If you, I mean, they have done a good job in hitting his command and control centers. They have done a good job in, as Dr. Ani said, in the no-drive, mission of the resolution. But they have not done a good job yet in protecting the cities like Misrata and Zintan, which is being daily bombarded by the tanks, by the, all the equipment that the Gaddafi security forces has. This is a challenge for the coalitions to protect the civilians. The pro-democracy forces can finish the job if the coalition also, execute their mission according to the resolution.
Oliver Miles in Oxford, let me bring you back to the conversation. Ali's saying there that it's almost a challenge here, if you like, for the coalition forces to help the people out on the ground. I've read something of an Anglo-French statement talking about trying to drive forces out of Benghazi. Again, possibly going beyond the mandate. Is everyone talking with the same voice here? President Obama again saying, let's get rid of the regime, but let's not do it through military force. The Anglo-French saying, hey, let's get in a bit harder in the ground. Who's saying what?
Look, I sympathise very much with what Ali Abu Zarqouk is saying. I, like the British government, like the American government, I think that the sooner Gaddafi is out, the better. But it's no good pretending that the resolution says things that it doesn't say. It does not say that we can arm the rebels. We can't. It's excluded explicitly in the text of the resolution. And at one point, I mean, Ali was talking about protecting people in Misrata from snipers, from Gaddafi's snipers. Well, would that we could, but how are we going to do that without sending in troops on the ground? And is anyone suggesting that?
Ali, how about a quick response from you before I go back to Mustafa?
No, Sir Miles, I mean, the question is that the snipers are protected by the tanks and by the artilleries. If it were only the snipers, it won't be a problem for the people of Misrata to get rid of them. But they cannot do anything against the tanks which are roaming in the streets and the squares of the city.
Let's go back to Mustafa Alani, as I said I would. In the end, are we looking at, from all our discussions here, I'm starting to feel like we've got a resolution that was perhaps never going to work. It was rushed through. Everyone said we've got to do something, and it happened within a week or so. But in the end, no one thought about where it was actually going to lead to.
This is the maximum we are able to achieve in the Security Council resolution without problem with the Chinese and the Russian. But the question here, how we're going to understand the resolution. The question of no-drive zone, this is very important actually, because what happened, by air action you can take all the armored or the tanks, but you cannot, from the air, you cannot distinguish who is fighting with Gaddafi and who is fighting against Gaddafi, especially when those people changing their clothes and wearing civilian clothes. So it is very difficult without putting forces on the ground, and this will never happen actually. So the only option to make the resistant, the rebel groups strong militarily, and they can do the action, what we call clearing the ground by their own action. But here, my imagination is Mr. Gaddafi going to pull all his forces to Tripoli. And they're going to fortify Tripoli. And we're going to, basically, we cannot do anything to a city with 2 million people. What are we going to do? What Air Force is going to do for that?
Well, just to back up what Mustafa Alani was saying there, have a listen to this again, more of what President Obama said about taking further action.
We also have the ability to stop Gaddafi's forces in their tracks without putting American troops on the ground.
And this is an important point, obviously, isn't it, Mustafa? Seeing as you're nodding there, I'll come back to you, that President Obama doesn't want to get himself involved further with boots on the ground. But again, if he thinks he can take the situation further without doing that, well, what do you think?
I think he will not be able to do that unless it take time and retrain the rebel forces, organize them, arm them, basically create another army on the ground equal to Gaddafi army. And I believe this is achievable, but it will take a long time. This is the problem we're going to face. And the public opinion is going to change in Europe and United States. As long as the war prolongs, we're going to face more opposition in the street of United States and European countries.
Okay, let's get away from the battlefield, if you like, gentlemen, and look at the other options, because we heard Barack Obama say earlier about using non-military means to remove Colonel Gaddafi. I'll start with Oliver Miles again in the UK to talk about this one. The simple fact is that Colonel Gaddafi is not a man who would respond to non-military means. He hasn't for decades, and he's probably not about to start now.
Yes, but nor is he a Superman. He can't run an opposition on his own. He can't run a military operation on his own. He has to have support. And what we should be doing, and it's not an easy one, but what we should be doing is looking for every possible way to undermine his support, to draw away his core supporters, to encourage the morale of the rebels. I think those are the things we should be concentrating on. And I think those will be outside, to a great extent, outside the military sphere. Of course, what we've done in the military sphere already has been very useful in that respect, no doubt. The reason why those rather important centres of Ajdabia and Ras Lanuf and Masal Briga fell to the rebels is because the Gaddafi forces were demoralised by the fact that their tanks and heavy weapons had been destroyed to a considerable extent. But maybe we've played that card as far as we can take it, and now we have to find other ways. And for example, I was very intrigued, I think far more important than what's been going on in London today. I was very intrigued to read about Moussa Koussa suddenly turning up in Tunisia. I would like to know why he's turned up in Tunisia. Is he the first of the rats to leave the sinking ship?
Well, we'll talk about the London conference in a moment. Ali Abu Zakuk, could that work? The idea of, as Oliver's suggesting, knock down the walls effectively that surround Colonel Gaddafi, take out his support, and he could go with them.
For sure, I assure you that the coalition forces have tried to hit his command and control centers in Bab el-Azaziyah barracks and some of his other installations, and they can still paralyze and they can still neutralize his forces. That will encourage the people to really finish their job. Regardless of his armament and, you know, all of his machinery, Zawiya stood for them with simple guns for more than a month. And Zawiya now, by the way, nobody speaks about it. It's a city that has been pacified and more than 4,000 to 5,000 people, you know, taken in detention. Not to speak about Zwara, which also been pacified by the forces of Gaddafi. He is trying to do the same to Misrata and Zintan. I think I am really calling all the forces of the coalition to protect the people of the cities. And Sir Miles, I don't think that we can interfere to hit with the snipers, but we can interfere to stop the tanks and the artillery from hitting Misrata. And hitting Zintan.
Okay, just to go back to the point I was making, and let's bring in Mustafa Alani again to talk about this idea of, as I phrased it, knocking down the walls around Colonel Gaddafi. What Ali Abu Zakuk was saying is that it could work, it could be done. My question is, will it work, do you think? Are the personalities who surround Gaddafi and the personality of the man himself, is it the type of situation where you could knock out that support and knock out the man himself?
You see, this is a regime which depends on one man, actually. It's a one-man show. And Mr. Obama reference to the non-military means is the reference to intelligence means, which mean in our language is assassination. assassination by Air Force or assassination by people around him. Once Mr. Gaddafi disappeared, the whole regime going to collapse. It's a house of cards, basically. And this is what he means by the non-military means. So you don't need to occupy the capital. If you if you liquidate the leadership, especially Mr. Gaddafi, I think the regime going to collapse and people around him going to disappear. This is what happened with Saddam Hussein. He was left alone when the forces moved. But in the Iraqi case, we need ground forces. Here, we have a mandate which not allow the ground forces. So we have to use intelligence means now.
Oliver Miles, we're starting to run down the clock on Inside Story, so I'll come back to you with a final question, seeing as you did mention the London conference. Aside from a good show of international support, what does a conference like that, what can a conference like that do?
Well, I'm not very hopeful of the conference. I think that the aim that was defined by William Hague, and I think by the others who initiated the conference at the beginning, was to broaden and deepen support for the action of the coalition. Well, I don't think they've been very successful in broadening it, because if you look at the people who've actually been at the conference, a lot of countries that could play a valuable role are not there. The big Arab countries, we don't see Egypt. Well, perhaps that's understandable. We don't see Tunisia. We don't see Algeria, Saudi Arabia, Sudan. None of them are there. None of the big Africans are there. Now, I personally think that one thing we should have been talking about, we haven't talked about, is the question whether it would be wise and right to organise some kind of bolt hole for Gaddafi. And there's been talk of maybe finding somewhere in Africa to which he could be helped to escape. I think personally that is better than a showdown which will involve so much bloodshed. I'm not a great believer in the International Criminal Court as a way of solving these problems, nor incidentally as the United States, which of course has never ratified the International Criminal Court, so it's rather bizarre that they should be supporting its use in this particular instance.
Ali, in Washington, would you feel better about these sorts of gatherings like the one we see in London if more Arab countries, if more African countries would commit to it, and so it didn't just look like the West against an Arab country again?
Well, I think we start from the point that he lost Gaddafi's regime, lost its legitimacy from the Arab League of Arab States. It's lost its legitimacy from the Organization of Islamic Conference, even from the African Union. So political-wise, none of these organizations that he belonged to consider him to be a legitimate member. Then we have the coalition, and the meeting in London, I think attended by representatives from the National Transitional Council there, is a good, I think, asset for the recognition of the Council and for the support of looking at means and ways. Maybe there will be others who will accept him. I don't mind. Personally, I can speak that getting rid of Gaddafi in any way possible will be the easier way if we can get rid of him and let the people of Libya, for the first time breathe freely after 42 years. The question is that, as Dr. Ani said, he is a one-man show. And when you're talking about one-man show, he is sometimes, in his megalomaniac attitude, doesn't listen to anybody else. And he should be taken by means that can neutralize him for good.
Mustafa Alani, I've got a minute left. I'm going to leave the final word to you. Let's hypothesize. Let's say I bring you back for a conversation here in another 2 weeks, 3 weeks, let's say up to a month. Do you think we'll still be almost in the same position?
I think we could be surprised how fast the regime going to collapse. And there is another possibility. I cannot really put my money on one option. The other one, he going to withdraw to Tripoli, and we're going to have a prolonged confrontation in Tripoli because of the civilian population. And we can't see he disappear by assassination, or by disintegration of the regime, or by air action hitting his headquarters, and he's a dead man. So I can't really, very difficult to put my money on one option, but I think we're going to see, there is possibility that the regime going to collapse quicker than what we think.
Gentlemen, great discussion today. I want to thank you all for joining us on Inside Story. Oliver Miles in Oxford, Mustafa Alani there in Dubai, and Ali Abu Zakuk in Washington, DC. Gentlemen, thank you. Thank you as well, our viewers, for joining us for Inside Story. Send us your comments, your suggestions, whatever you'd like to say. Inside Story at aljazeera.net is our email address. From the whole team, it's goodbye for now. Gaddafi.